The evening sun cast long shadows across Wilson's pharmacy as Officer James Mitchell pulled his patrol car into the nearly empty parking lot. The dashboard clock showed 6:45 p.m., and he had just received a routine shoplifting call. After 5 years on the force, these calls had become all too familiar in this part of town, where many families struggled to make ends meet. The store's bell chimed as Mitchell stepped inside, his boots squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. Mr. Wilson, the elderly store owner, rushed toward him with worried eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses. His white pharmacy coat was wrinkled, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the back of the store. "Officer, I'm glad you're here," Mr. Wilson said, lowering his voice. "There's a young black girl, probably 14 or 15. She's been walking up and down the aisles for the past 20 minutes, putting things in her backpack when she thinks no one is watching." Mitchell nodded, pulling out his small notepad. "Can you describe what she's wearing?" "A red hoodie, blue jeans, and white sneakers. She looks like a good kid, actually. That's what makes this so sad." Mr. Wilson shook his head, genuine concern crossing his weathered face. "I've seen her in here before with her mother, but never alone like this." As Mitchell jotted down the details, the security camera feed behind the counter caught his attention. On the grainy screen, he could see a young girl matching the description in aisle 3, the medicine aisle. She was looking over her shoulder every few seconds, her movements nervous and jerky. The officer's mind wandered briefly to the dozens of similar cases he'd handled. Most ended the same way, with tears, handcuffs, and another young life getting its first taste of the criminal justice system. Something about this one felt different, though. Maybe it was the way the girl's hands shook as she reached for items, or how she kept wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Mitchell made his way through the store, his footsteps deliberately heavy to announce his presence. As he turned into aisle 3, the girl was gone. A quick glance down neighboring aisles showed no sign of her, but a flash of red through the front window told him everything he needed to know. "She just left," he called to Mr. Wilson, already moving toward the exit. "I'll handle it from here." The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped outside. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the rustling of fallen leaves across the sidewalk. About 50 yards ahead, the girl in the red hoodie was walking quickly, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest. Mitchell had two choices. He could call out and potentially startle her into running, or he could follow quietly until she felt cornered. Neither option sat well with him. In his experience, fear only made situations worse, especially with young people. He noticed something else as he watched her. She wasn't running. Most shoplifters her age would have bolted the moment they spotted a police car. Instead, she was walking with her head down, shoulders hunched, as if carrying a weight much heavier than whatever was in her backpack. The street lights were just starting to flicker on, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. Mitchell could see families through lit windows, settling in for dinner or helping with homework. It was the kind of normal, peaceful evening that made him love being a cop, the chance to protect these quiet moments. "Miss," he finally called out, keeping his voice firm but gentle, "I need to speak with you for a moment." The girl stopped dead in her tracks. Her whole body tensed, but she didn't run. Slowly, she turned around, and Mitchell got his first clear look at her face. Tears had left streaks down her cheeks, and her eyes held a mix of fear and something else, desperation. As Mitchell approached her, he maintained a non-threatening distance. His hand stayed far from his weapon, resting casually at his side. 15 years on the force had taught him that body language often spoke louder than words. "I'm Officer Mitchell," he said, watching as she clutched her backpack even tighter. "I think you and I need to have a conversation about what happened in the pharmacy." The sun had almost completely set now, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment would change both their lives forever. Keisha Thompson stood under the streetlight, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The police officer's presence made her feel small, even though he kept his distance. She thought about running, but her legs felt too heavy to move. Besides, where would she go? Home wasn't an option, not without the medicine her little brother so desperately needed. "What's your name?" Officer Mitchell asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. He noticed how young she looked up close, probably not more than 15. Her red hoodie was worn at the edges, and one of her shoelaces was broken. "Keisha," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening traffic. A car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating her face, showing eyes red from crying. Mitchell took a small step forward, careful to maintain a comfortable distance. "Keisha, Mr. Wilson saw you putting items in your backpack. Would you like to tell me about that?" She looked down at her worn sneakers, tears beginning to fall again. The weight of the stolen items felt like rocks in her backpack. In all her 15 years, she had never stolen anything, not even a piece of candy. Her mother had raised her better than that. I can't," she managed to say, hugging the backpack closer. A cold breeze rustled the leaves around them, making her shiver. Or maybe it was fear making her tremble. She wasn't sure anymore. Officer Mitchell studied her body language. In his years of police work, he had learned to read people well. The teens he usually caught shoplifting showed different signs: defiance, anger, or sometimes a thrill-seeking gleam in their eyes. Keisha showed none of these. Instead, he saw shame, fear, and something that looked a lot like desperation. "Listen," he said, taking out his small flashlight but keeping it pointed at the ground. "Whatever's going on, running away won't make it better. Why don't we start by looking at what's in the backpack?" Keisha's fingers tightened around the straps. Through her tears, she could see the officer's badge catching the streetlight. Her mother had always taught her to respect the police, to be honest, to do the right thing. But what was the right thing when your 6-year-old brother was burning up with fever and you had no money for medicine? A nearby church bell chimed 7 times, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Windows in nearby homes glowed warm and bright, families inside probably sitting down to dinner. Keisha thought of her own home, dark because they were trying to save on electricity, empty because her mother was working her second job, and quiet except for her brother's feverish whimpers. "Officer," she started, her voice cracking. I don't usually." "Take your time," Mitchell said. He noticed how she kept looking down the street, not like someone planning to run, but like someone worried about getting home. His instincts told him there was more to this story. With trembling hands, Keisha slowly unzipped her backpack. The sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet street. She could feel her chest tightening, knowing that once the officer saw what she had taken, everything would change. Her mother would be so disappointed. Her siblings would be scared. And she would probably end up in juvenile detention. "I can explain," she said, though she wasn't sure she could. "How do you explain choosing between breaking the law and watching your little brother suffer? How do you make someone understand that kind of helplessness?" Officer Mitchell moved his flashlight beam slightly higher, not directly at Keisha, but enough to see into the backpack as she opened it. His expression changed as the light revealed the contents, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, broken only by distant traffic and the soft rustle of leaves. In that moment, standing under the gathering darkness of a streetlight, both their lives were about to change in ways neither could have expected. Officer Mitchell's flashlight beam revealed the contents of Keisha's backpack, and his stern expression softened. Inside weren't the usual stolen items he expected to find. No expensive makeup, no electronics, no jewelry. Instead, he saw children's fever medicine, a digital thermometer, and some basic groceries: bread, peanut butter, and a small container of soup. The receipt she couldn't afford to pay was crumpled at the bottom of the bag. Mitchell picked it up carefully, smoothing out the wrinkled paper. The total came to $28.17. Such a small amount, he thought, but it might as well have been $1,000 to someone who had nothing. "It's for my brother," Keisha said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice trembled as she continued. "Tommy's only 6, and his fever won't go down. We tried cold washcloths, but nothing's working." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, leaving a damp spot on the worn red fabric. Mitchell lowered his flashlight, letting the streetlight illuminate them instead. In its soft orange glow, you could see Keisha more clearly now, not as a shoplifter, but as a scared older sister trying to help her family the only way she could think of. "Where's your mother?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across them before disappearing around the corner. Keisha shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her worn sneakers scuffing against the concrete. "She works 2 jobs, the morning shift at the diner and night cleaning offices. Keisha's voice caught in her throat. "She's been too sick to work this week. No work means no money, and without insurance." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Mitchell understood. He'd seen it too many times in this neighborhood. Hard-working families, one missed paycheck away from disaster. The system had too many cracks, and too many people fell through them. "How long has your brother been sick?" Mitchell asked, glancing at the children's medicine in the backpack. The bright purple package promised fast fever relief, the same brand he remembered his mother buying for him when he was young. 3 days, Keisha replied, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. He was okay at first, but last night his temperature went really high. Mom's sick too, trying to take care of him, but she can barely get out of bed. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. I didn't know what else to do. Mitchell felt something tighten in his chest. The radio on his shoulder crackled with distant police chatter, reminding him of his duty. By the book, this was simple. Take her back to the store, file a report, process her through the system. But 20 years of experience had taught him that life wasn't always that simple. He thought about his own mother, who had raised him alone. There had been times when she'd gone hungry so he could eat, times when she worked despite being sick because missing work wasn't an option. He remembered one winter when a kind stranger had helped them, changing the course of their lives with a simple act of compassion. Looking at the items in Keisha's backpack again, Mitchell made a decision. Sometimes, he realized, protecting and serving meant more than just enforcing the law. Sometimes it meant being the help that people desperately needed. "Keisha," he said, reaching for his wallet. "I want you to come back to the store with me." Her eyes widened with fear, and she took a small step backward. "Please, Officer Mitchell, I can't go to jail. My family needs me." "We're not going for the reason you think," he replied, his voice firm but kind. The streetlight above them flickered, casting shifting shadows on the sidewalk. "There's a right way to handle this situation, and we're going to figure it out together." As they stood there in the growing darkness, neither of them could have predicted how this moment would change not just their lives, but their entire community. The walk back to Wilson's pharmacy was quiet, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and distant traffic. Officer Mitchell noticed how Keisha kept wiping her eyes with her sleeve, trying to compose herself. Under the passing streetlights, she looked even younger than 15. As they approached the store's bright windows, Keisha stopped suddenly. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just Tommy who's sick. My mom has the flu too, and my sisters Sarah and Maya haven't eaten properly since yesterday." Mitchell turned to face her, noting how the store's fluorescent lights cast shadows under her eyes. "How many siblings do you have?" "3, Keisha replied, adjusting the empty backpack on her shoulder. "Tommy's 6, Sarah's 9, and Maya's 11. I'm the oldest, so it's my job to take care of them when Mom can't." Pride mixed with worry in her voice as she spoke about her family. Through the store window, they could see Mr. Wilson reorganizing shelves, occasionally glancing their way. The open sign buzzed quietly in the growing darkness. "Tell me about your mother," Mitchell said gently, moving them to a bench outside the store. Sometimes, he knew, people just needed someone to listen. Keisha sat down, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "Mom's amazing. She never complains, even when she's tired. She works at Linda's diner from 6 in the morning until 2, then cleans offices until 9 at night." She paused, twisting the frayed end of her hoodie string. "But this week, she could barely get out of bed. The flu hit her hard, and we don't have insurance." Mitchell nodded, understanding filling his chest. He'd seen this story before. Hard-working people caught in impossible situations. One missed paycheck, one illness, and everything could fall apart. "The diner doesn't give her sick days," Keisha continued, anger creeping into her voice for the first time, "and the cleaning company said they'd find someone else that she couldn't come in. We were doing okay before, not great, but okay, then everyone got sick, and..." She spread her hands helplessly. A young couple walked past them into the pharmacy, the bell chiming cheerfully. Through the windows, Mitchell could see them picking up snacks, laughing together. The contrast with Keisha's situation wasn't lost on him. "What about your father?" Mitchell asked carefully, watching her reaction. Keisha's face hardened slightly. "Left 3 years ago, said he was going to the store to buy cigarettes. Never came back." She shrugged, trying to seem indifferent, but Mitchell could hear the hurt in her voice. "Mom says we're better off without him, and she's right. He never helped much anyway." The evening had grown colder, and Keisha shivered in her thin hoodie. Mitchell noticed a small hole in the sleeve, carefully stitched up with different colored thread. So when Tommy's fever got worse, Mitchell prompted quietly, "You decided to take matters into your own hands." Tears welled up in Keisha's eyes again. "I tried everything else first. I looked for odd jobs, but nobody wants to hire a 15-year-old. I checked Mom's purse, but there was only $6 left. I even tried calling our old church, but they didn't answer." She wiped her eyes roughly. "When I heard Tommy crying last night because his head hurt so bad, I couldn't just do nothing." Mitchell reached into his pocket, feeling his wallet. In his mind, he could hear his supervisor's voice warning about protocol and proper procedure. But he could also hear his mother's voice from long ago, telling him that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking from the expected path. "Keisha," he said, standing up, "I want you to come inside with me. There's something we need to do." She looked up at him nervously. "Are you going to arrest me?" Mitchell shook his head, a small smile forming on his face. "No, Keisha, I'm going to help you. But first, we need to talk to Mr. Wilson. Sometimes people can surprise you with their kindness." As they walked toward the pharmacy door, the bell chiming as they entered, both could sense that this night was about to take an unexpected turn. As Officer Mitchell stood in Wilson's pharmacy with Keisha, memories from 20 years ago flooded his mind. He was no longer seeing the bright fluorescent lights and neatly stocked shelves, but instead remembering a cold December night from his own childhood. He had been 12 then, lying in bed with a high fever while his mother Sarah Mitchell worked an extra shift at the local diner. They'd had no heat that winter because they couldn't afford the bills. His mother had wrapped him in all their blankets, leaving none for herself. "Mr. Wilson," Mitchell called out, his voice slightly rough with emotion. The elderly pharmacist looked up from his paperwork, adjusting his glasses. "Could we talk privately for a moment?" As Keisha waited near the entrance, Mitchell walked to the counter. The floor squeaked beneath his heavy police boots. The sound reminded him of another memory. The way their old apartment's floors had creaked under his mother's tired footsteps when she would check on him late at night. "You see, my mother raised me alone too," Mitchell explained quietly to Mr. Wilson. "One winter, when I was sick with pneumonia, we had nothing. No money, no medicine, not even heat." He paused, looking back at Keisha, who stood nervously playing with the zipper of her empty backpack. Mr. Wilson leaned forward, his kind eyes showing interest. The pharmacy's clock ticked softly in the background, marking each quiet moment. "There was this one night," Mitchell continued, "when Mom was desperate. She had no money for medicine, and I couldn't stop coughing. She went to 3 different pharmacies, begging them to let her pay later." His hands tightened slightly on the counter. The first 2 turned her away. The memory was still clear, his mother coming home in tears, snow melting from her worn shoes. But then her expression had changed, and she pulled out a bottle of cough medicine. The third pharmacist, Mitchell said, his voice growing softer, was an older man named Mr. Chen. He not only gave her the medicine but also included some food and vitamins. Wouldn't take a penny until she could afford it. He straightened his uniform jacket. "That kindness changed our lives. Mom was able to keep working, and I got better. We paid him back in small amounts over 6 months." Mr. Wilson nodded slowly, understanding crossing his face. Through the store windows, the evening had grown darker, and the street lights cast long shadows across the parking lot. "That's why I became a police officer," Mitchell admitted, watching Keisha through the corner of his eye. "Not just to enforce laws, but to help people the way Mr. Chen helped us. Sometimes people don't need punishment, they need compassion." He reached for his wallet, but Mr. Wilson raised his hand to stop him. The old pharmacist's eyes had grown misty behind his glasses. "James," Mr. Wilson said, using Mitchell's first name, "I've owned this store for 30 years. I've seen every kind of shoplifter there is." He looked over at Keisha, who was now pretending to read a magazine while stealing nervous glances their way. "That young lady isn't a criminal. She's a scared big sister trying to take care of her family." Mitchell felt relief wash over him. Sometimes, he knew, people could surprise you with their kindness, just like Mr. Chen had done all those years ago. "When I was training to be a police officer," Mitchell said, "they taught us about law and order. But my mother taught me something more important. She taught me about humanity." He turned to look directly at Mr. Wilson. "Sometimes, the right thing to do isn't in any rule book." The old pharmacist smiled, already reaching for a shopping basket. Well then, Officer Mitchell, let's see what we can do to help this family. He paused, then added softly, and tell Keisha she's welcome to come to me directly next time. No child should have to steal medicine for their sick brother. As Mitchell walked back to Keisha, he saw hope beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. Sometimes the past doesn't just teach us lessons. It gives us a chance to pass on the kindness we once received. The fluorescent lights of Wilson's pharmacy hummed quietly as Officer Mitchell walked back to where Keisha stood. Her hands were shaking slightly as she put down the magazine she'd been pretending to read. She couldn't meet his eyes, still expecting the worst. Keisha, Mitchell said gently, Mr. Wilson and I would like to help you get what your family needs. He gestured toward the aisles. But this time, we're going to do it the right way. Confusion crossed her face, then disbelief as she watched Mitchell pull out his wallet. Mr. Wilson had already grabbed a shopping basket and was walking toward them with a kind smile. I don't understand, Keisha whispered, looking between the two men. Aren't you going to arrest me? Mr. Wilson shook his head, his gray hair catching the light. No, young lady. Sometimes life puts good people in difficult situations. What matters is how we help each other through those times. Tears started flowing down Keisha's cheeks again, but these were different from her earlier tears of fear and shame. These were tears of relief, of overwhelming gratitude. First, Mitchell said, taking the shopping basket from Mr. Wilson, let's get that medicine for Tommy. Then we'll pick up some things for your mom and sisters too. He paused, remembering his own mother's pride. Consider it a loan, if that makes you feel better. You can pay it back when your family gets back on their feet. As they walked through the aisles, Mr. Wilson pointed out the best medicines for flu symptoms. He added vitamins to the basket, explaining they would help boost the family's immune system. Mitchell noticed how the old pharmacist chose the larger sizes of everything, making sure the family would have enough to last. The fever medicine works best with plenty of fluids, Mr. Wilson explained, adding bottles of sports drinks to their basket. And for your mother. He selected a stronger cold medicine from behind the counter, specially made for adults. Keisha watched in amazement as the basket filled up. Besides medicine, they added soup, crackers, bread, and easy-to-prepare meals. Mr. Wilson even included a small stuffed bear for Tommy, saying sick children sometimes needed comfort as much as medicine. At the counter, Mitchell insisted on paying for everything himself, but Mr. Wilson wouldn't hear of it. Half of this is on me, the pharmacist said firmly, already adjusting prices in his register, and I'm adding my personal discount. The total came to much more than Keisha's original $28, but between Mitchell and Mr. Wilson, the bill was quickly paid. As Mr. Wilson carefully bagged everything, he wrote his personal phone number on the receipt. Keisha, he said, handing her the paper, if your family needs anything, anything at all, you call this number. No more stealing, okay? Just call me, day or night. Keisha nodded, unable to speak through her tears. The bags felt heavy in her arms, but it was a good kind of heavy, the weight of help and hope rather than shame and fear. I'll drive you home, Mitchell said, taking some of the bags. We should get this medicine to your brother as soon as possible. As they walked toward the patrol car, the store's bell chiming behind them, Keisha finally found her voice. I don't know how to thank you both, she said softly. I never expected. You don't need to thank us, Mitchell interrupted gently, opening the car's door. Just promise me something. Years from now, when you see someone else in need, remember tonight. Remember that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change someone's whole world. The patrol car's lights cast a soft glow in the parking lot as they loaded the bags. Inside the store, Mr. Wilson watched them through the window, smiling as he remembered all the times in his 30 years as a pharmacist when bending the rules had felt more right than following them. None of them knew it yet, but this night would spark changes that would reach far beyond just one family in need. Officer Mitchell's patrol car pulled up to a small apartment building on Cedar Street. The building was old but well kept, with potted plants lining the entrance despite the cold weather. Through a ground-floor window, you could see the dim light of what must have been a lamp running on its lowest setting to save electricity. This is it, Keisha said quietly, gathering some of the bags. We're in 1B. Her voice trembled slightly, but now with excitement rather than fear. She couldn't wait to show her family the medicine and food they so desperately needed. As they walked to the door, Mitchell carried the heavier bags. The concrete path was cracked, with determined dandelions pushing through despite the approaching winter. Somehow, it reminded him of Keisha's family, surviving against tough odds. When Keisha opened the door, they heard a young boy's coughing from inside. The apartment was neat but spare, with mismatched furniture that had been carefully maintained. A worn blanket was draped over the couch where a woman lay sleeping. Keisha's mother. Keisha? The woman stirred, her voice hoarse. Is that you? Then she saw the police officer behind her daughter, and despite her illness, she tried to sit up quickly. Oh my God, what's happened? It's okay, Mrs. Thompson, Mitchell said quickly, setting down the bags. Everything's fine. I'm Officer Mitchell, and I'm here to help. Over the next few minutes, as Keisha explained what had happened at the pharmacy, her mother's expression changed from fear to shame to overwhelming gratitude. Tommy, the 6-year-old, came out of his room wrapped in a blanket, his small face lighting up at the sight of the stuffed bear poking out of one of the bags. But Mitchell noticed other things too. The empty kitchen cabinets visible through the open door, the thin curtains that did little to keep out the cold, the way the children's clothes showed signs of careful mending. This family needed more than just one night's help. Back in his patrol car, Mitchell made some calls, first to his sister Rachel, who worked as a social worker, then to Pastor Mike at his church, who ran a food bank. Finally, to his old friend David at the community center. With each call, the network of help grew larger. The next day, things began to happen. Rachel arrived at the Thompsons' apartment with information about medical assistance programs and job training opportunities for Mrs. Thompson. The church's food bank arranged regular deliveries. The community center started an after-school program where Keisha and her siblings could get help with homework and a hot meal. Word spread through the police department, too. When Mitchell's fellow officers heard the story, they wanted to help. Officer Sarah Martinez organized a winter clothing drive. Officer Tom Chen, whose father had been the kind pharmacist from Mitchell's childhood, set up a fund to help families in similar situations. The local diner where Mrs. Thompson worked heard about her situation. The owner, touched by the story, not only held her job but also created a sick leave policy for all employees. The cleaning company, faced with community pressure, did the same. A week later, Mitchell stopped by the apartment again. The change was remarkable. The cabinets had food, the children were getting medical checkups, and Mrs. Thompson was recovering, knowing her job was secure. But the biggest change was in their eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by hope. Officer Mitchell, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice stronger now, how can we ever repay everyone's kindness? Mitchell smiled, remembering what Mr. Chen had told his mother all those years ago. Just help someone else when you can. That's how kindness grows. The story of the police officer and the young girl caught shoplifting medicine began to spread through the community. It wasn't just about one family anymore. It had become a wake-up call, showing how many families were silently struggling and how a community could come together to help. As Mitchell drove through his patrol route that evening, he noticed small changes everywhere. Neighbors were checking on neighbors. Local businesses were starting assistance programs. The community was awakening to the needs around them, proving that sometimes the greatest changes start with the smallest acts of compassion. 6 months had passed since that cold evening when Officer Mitchell caught Keisha trying to steal medicine for her brother. The spring sun now warmed the streets, and Cedar Street was blooming with new life. Outside the Thompsons' apartment building, the crack in the concrete path was now filled with bright yellow dandelions. Inside apartment 1B, the changes were even more remarkable. Mrs. Thompson stood in her kitchen, packing lunches for her children. She wore her new diner manager uniform with pride. Her promotion had come 2 months ago, after she helped implement the restaurant's new employee assistance program. Mom, Keisha called from the living room. Officer Mitchell's here. She was sitting at a small desk they'd gotten from the community center, working on her homework. Her latest math test, marked with a bright red A, was proudly displayed on the refrigerator. Mitchell stepped into the apartment, immediately noticing the differences. The rooms were warmer now, both in temperature and spirit. New curtains hung at the windows, family photos decorated the walls, and the kitchen cabinets were full. But the biggest changes were in the faces that greeted him. Tommy, now fully recovered and energetic, ran to give Mitchell a hug, still clutching the stuffed bear from that night at the pharmacy. Sarah and Maya looked up from their books, waving cheerfully. Gone were the shadows of worry that had once darkened their young faces. "You're just in time," Mrs. Thompson said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Keisha was about to tell me about her new volunteer program." Keisha beamed with pride. "We're starting a peer support group at school," she explained. "It's for students whose families need help but don't know where to find it." She pulled out a colorful flyer she'd designed. "Mr. Wilson from the pharmacy is one of our emergency contacts." Mitchell smiled, remembering how the old pharmacist had become like a grandfather to the Thompson children. He even started a medicine assistance program at his store, helping other families avoid the desperate situation Keisha had faced. "The police department's community outreach program is growing too," Mitchell shared, sitting down at their small kitchen table. "We've helped 50 families in the past 6 months. Every officer now carries resource cards with information about food banks, medical assistance, and job training programs." Mrs. Thompson served coffee, using the mugs donated by her coworkers at the diner. "I still can't believe how much has changed," she said softly. "That night, when Keisha came home with you, I thought our world was ending. Instead, it was just beginning." The evening sun streamed through the windows, catching the frame of a newspaper article on the wall. It featured a photo of Keisha and Officer Mitchell outside Wilson's pharmacy, under the headline, "Local Police Officers' Act of Kindness Sparks Community Change." "Remember how scared I was?" Keisha laughed, but her eyes were serious. "I thought I was going to jail. Instead, you taught me that asking for help isn't shameful, it's brave." Mitchell thought about all the changes he'd seen. The police department had transformed its approach to similar cases, focusing more on understanding and assistance than punishment. Local businesses had created support programs for employees in need. The community had woken up to the struggles of its most vulnerable members. "Your story helped people understand," Mitchell said, watching Tommy play with his bear. "Sometimes good people end up in desperate situations. They don't need judgment, they need compassion and support." Mrs. Thompson nodded, tears in her eyes. "And now we help others whenever we can. Last week, I noticed one of my new waitresses struggling like I was. Thanks to our employee assistance program, she didn't have to choose between working sick or losing her job." As the evening wound down, Mitchell stood to leave. Outside, neighbors were returning from work, stopping to chat on the sidewalk. Children played safely under watchful community eyes. The street felt different now, warmer, more connected, more alive with possibility. "You know," Keisha said, walking him to the door, "that night could have ruined my life. Instead, it showed me how one act of kindness can change everything. Someday, I want to be a social worker, so I can help other families the way everyone helped us." Mitchell looked back at the Thompson family, no longer victims of circumstance but active participants in their community's transformation. Sometimes the best way to enforce the law was to first enforce compassion. That night 6 months ago hadn't just saved one family, it sparked a movement of kindness that continued to grow, proving that sometimes the greatest changes start with the smallest choices.